Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pharma Times editor John Pinching, and welcome to this innovative trials webinar entitled Patient Recruitment, Think Global, Act Local. As globalization has unfolded over the last 50 years, technology, science, and medicine have evolved dramatically. The design of clinical trials has also modernized, yielding complex data and accelerating the pathway for countless therapies. The COVID-19 pandemic, however, served to highlight that the ongoing challenge of inclusivity in patient recruitment cannot be solved through globalized networks alone. The answer instead is on our doorsteps, through expert knowledge of local communities. Participation in clinical trials relies on transparency and trust, and people from different backgrounds, economic groups, nationalities, religions, and of different identities must be engaged. Our panelists today will be sharing their experiences and wrestling with some of these conundrums. They are Georgia Hardy, Site Operations Lead at Innovative Trials, Nicole Yingst, a strategist at Pfizer, and Barbara Orloz-Kaminska, an Innovative Trials Clinical Enrollment Manager based in Poland. Following their presentation, we've got our patient recruitment Q&A session. During this and indeed the whole webinar, you can use the BrightTalk interface to submit questions to the panel. Throughout the webinar, we will also have a series of polling questions, which again, you can use the interface to answer. Okay, I'll now hand the controls over to Georgia. All yours, Georgia.
Perfect, thank you. Brilliant. So hopefully technology hasn't failed ourselves and you can see a polling question on your screen. So to kind of start this webinar, we're really asking the audience a question. So the question is, are you familiar with in-country patient recruitment specialists? So we'll just kind of wait a moment as we get some results in. So thank you for those that have submitted. And then we can delve a little bit deeper. Perfect. Okay, so we've got some of the results through. So at the moment, we've got 60% says no and 40% says yes. So that's excellent. So this is kind of, why I want to do this initial introduction. So I'm initially going to start by talking about what an in-country patient recruitment specialist is. So thank you for those that answered, but for those of you that don't know what an in-country patient recruitment specialist is, they technically have clinical research experience. So they might be physicians, research nurses, study coordinators, CRAs, or trial managers, but they have a special interest within patient recruitment. Now, typically, these patient recruitment specialists provide one-to-one hands-on patient recruitment support to sites. Now, the purpose of their role is to essentially alleviate the burden from sites when focusing on patient recruitment for a particular study, but also increase enrollment activity at a site. The benefit of these patient recruitment specialists is because they're based in country, they know the local culture, and more importantly, they know the local regulatory requirements. So in-country patient recruitment specialists can vary in different ways, but typically this can be delivered on-site or virtually. And the benefit of these in-country patient recruitment specialists is they adapt their approach depending on the site and the individual location of the sites. So these in-country patient recruitment specialists will contact the sites and work with them to build a site-specific recruitment plan. And this might be strategies that are appropriate to the site and the location, but they'll also work to foresee any potential recruitment barriers and work at putting in place mitigation plans to kind of stop these recruitment barriers and in turn increase enrollment on a study. Another positive of these in-country patient recruitment specialists is that they maintain site engagement throughout a study. So keeping a particular study at the forefront of their mind. And also the purpose is to keep the momentum with recruitment going. So that's kind of the purpose of in-country, that's the definition of in-country patient recruitment specialist. Now, thank you to those that's answered the second poll. And the second poll question is, if you knew what a global patient recruitment specialist was, when you're running your global studies, do you utilize them? So it's great to see that the majority of the responses have said yes. So 81% of the people in this webinar have said yes, they do. So that's excellent. So kind of the purpose of this webinar really is to kind of give a case study as where these recruitment specialists have really aided towards the overall recruitment on a study. So in this webinar, we're going to talk through one particular case study, and this is the Tuscany 2 study. And this study was for ulcerative colitis. It was a phase 2b study, and it was a global study, so over 30 countries. But actually, recruitment was exceeding expectations that not all countries ended up kind of starting or participating in the study. And there was a scope for up to 189 sites. So it was a very large global study, and it was aimed at the target audience was adults with moderate to severe ulcerative colitis, and the recruitment target was 240 patients. So kind of we brainstormed some anticipated recruitment challenges. So a key thing to note was this study was actually running during the COVID-19 pandemic. So an anticipated challenge or a particular barrier that we anticipated from the sites and the country was related to COVID-19. There was also a requirement for participants to have an endoscopy. So that was reported as an anticipated barrier. The eligibility criteria reportedly was quite strict by some sites, so we kind of shared that as a potential barrier. And there was also the use of a placebo. So this is the study. It's a large global study, and kind of throughout this presentation, we're going to break it down and give some country insights to show kind of the different barriers that each particular country faced, and then some strategies that were put in place. So this particular study actually utilized in-country support. So there was recruitment specialists supporting countries, and materials were developed as well for this particular study. Now, the reason why we're using this one as a case study is that recruitment was actually met 12 months ahead of schedule. So this kind of hopefully demonstrates the benefit of using in-country patient recruitment support. So that's just kind of a study background of the particular case study that we're going to cover in this webinar. I'm now going to pass you over to Nicole Yinkst, who's the Associate Director of Patient Recruitment Programs at Pfizer.
Hello, everyone. I just want to ensure, Georgia, you can hear me okay still?
Yep, I can hear you.
Perfect. So hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Yinkst, and as I said, I am an Associate Director here at Pfizer for Patient Recruitment Programs. Really, my role is a strategist. So when we get a study in, I will work with other team members to develop an overarching recruitment and retention support strategy to ideally support success in the study. I work across our I&I space, so that's immunology and inflammatory conditions. So I am very familiar, and I actually worked on the Tuscany 2 study to develop this strategy from start to finish. So what I'll be presenting today is just kind of an overview of the approach a bit, but more so to expand more on what Georgia just shared with regards to some of the tools and tactics that we used. So just to start high level, looking at IBD space as a whole, of course, this is ulcerative colitis, but just in IBD in general, we're looking at kind of two key portions of the spectrum. We need to look in real time, so looking to support sites in identifying those potential participants who are in active disease, so have active flare. As was mentioned, it's moderate to severe, which is typical of most of these protocols and indications. So we want to ensure that we are supporting sites and being able to identify patients that come in symptomatic. We also want to ensure that sites are maximizing on both their internal and external patients to the site. So networking with colleagues and really anybody who could potentially see or talk to a patient that could be a good candidate for the study. And then, of course, we want to develop easy to incorporate tools, materials, but also any other tactics that could help, again, engage with those patients at the right time. We also want to look at the proactive state. So looking at patients who perhaps are not quite symptomatic as yet, again, we're having to find them at the right state. Typically, if they are symptomatic, they're already not feeling well. So the consideration of a clinical trial at that time, even though it's the right time from a symptom perspective, it may not be the right time from a mental perspective. So we want to also look at those opportunities to support sites in identifying those patients who perhaps tick all the boxes but just are not symptomatic yet. Engage with them, explain the study, explain what the site is doing, and see if we can't then engage that patient at the right time from a mental capacity. So that way, if they should become symptomatic, we don't ever want them to be, but if they do, then ideally we've hit them at the right time from both ends. And then we look at, again, still, we want to do this both internally and externally, making sure that we're feeding in those patients appropriately. And again, have those tools that can support really across all those processes. There we go. There was a little delay. So looking at the clinical trials and for the UC space, in particular for the Tuscany 2 study, we wanted to look at really 3 key areas. So the motivational factors. For all these patients, their end goal is the desire to be in remission for as long as possible. So often we'll find, and again for these protocols, we need patients who had lost that impact from their current treatment, or perhaps can't take certain treatments, whatever the case is. So again, they're looking for another opportunity to help in getting them back to remission and staying there as long as possible. What we've also found, and I should note that we did have some insights work being done, so panels of patients, so that we could just further dig down into their overall journey in their condition, but also understanding these motivational factors, what motivates them to consider participating in a clinical trial. And there is that emphasis in altruism. So we do have patients who have that desire to not only improve their own health, but more so looking at improvements in the space as a whole, so that those who have, and anyone in the future, and especially those who maybe have that genetic predisposition to it, there is that motivation to participate so that they can help develop further and maybe improved treatments. And then the influencers. This ties back to that external component and colleague networking. What we often find is patients will ultimately look to their physician, nurses, others who are part of their overall care as a trusted source of information. So again, that's why we want to work with sites to make sure that they're informing any and all of their network about the studies, and again, helping to convey those potentials to their patients. Family and friends and colleagues, anyone else in the community. We found that there's, of course, advocacy groups, some very prominent that we work with, but also just ensuring that we are informing patients, because you have that own personal network of those that you look to and work with, to, again, stay informed of what's happening within the UC space and in treatments. And then the concerns, Georgia touched on that too. Of course, we were doing all of this as part of COVID-19, so that did add a factor or layer to the considerations and concerns. However, there's also just the general ones that we typically find. So the loss of time from work, other commitments. There's already a commitment when you're trying to treat this disease as a whole, but having to add that on to some additional study components can be a big factor. Having to wash out of current treatments. So that's a big one. I know with a lot of these protocols, the clinicians continually try to find and minimize as much as possible that washout time frame. There's questions, potential side effects. I will continue to tie that up though to colleagues and just reaching out to the medical community. I found that to be a huge tactic that has impact, because if we can keep them informed, keep the physicians informed as well, that just helps in the communication to the patients and just helps with that overall motivation to take the next step forward. So I keep thinking I need to tell someone to go to the next slide, but it's me controlling this. So how can we impact our UC studies? And some of this, I won't go into too much redundancies, but you will see some areas that may tease out as, yes, I repeat things, but that's where I'll emphasize that this is what I find to be the most impactful when we're looking at overall recruitment and retention. So early patient identification, we talked about that with regards to just being proactive, looking at both spectrums of patients who may be active at point of care in their symptoms and disease state, and those who aren't. But again, you can still use those opportunities and touch points to inform patients about the study study. So we work with sites to ensure that they have the capacity to work within their own database with pre-screening. We do have a tool here at Pfizer to help sites in digging through their own patient base and pre-screening patients so that they can develop that cohort that they can pre-screen from and actually screen from and bring them in. We also work with, and we worked with Innovative to help sites in developing a really comprehensive recruitment plan. So looking at their own resources, what networks and what capacities do they have, but then also identifying those gaps. And that helps us to then make sure that we can provide them with those resources to fill those gaps and make sure that they just have that overall very comprehensive plan, and they can have those tactics and have the timelines and just have everything on the ready. And we did that very early in the game. So that way, again, we're being proactive in identifying and just arming sites with the tools they need versus waiting for a rescue situation. They're behind, and then we're having to scramble to find those tools. We had very complex tools in the beginning stages of the study, which I think was very helpful. And then just working with partners such as advocacy groups, and again, just other trusted sources of information, making sure we had that information for patients. So again, we could work with any of those sites in the beginning. And then we also had very efficient site-led patient recruitment. So we incorporated materials to support enrollment. We developed, like I said, a very comprehensive kit of brochures, flyers, study guides, so that helped with compliance aspects as well. And just to keep those patients informed from start to finish throughout their journey in the study. And then we also aided sites with regards to local outreach. So we're talking about within country. So we did ensure everything was obviously in language, but we also took into account, and this ties back to the recruitment planning, any nuances within each country. There were some pieces or some tools that sites just didn't feel were going to be helpful to them. So again, we didn't cherry pick, I will say, in the beginning stages, but there were just some where we maybe didn't ship certain materials and pieces to sites where they didn't utilize them, and that was okay. Again, we just wanted to make sure we have any and all tools available, so that way sites could start to incorporate those when they saw it fit. Or again, if just culturally it wasn't going to be appropriate, they didn't have to use them, and that's okay. But we just made sure that we had something that we were able to customize for each site and also countries to make sure that it was applicable. And then compliance and retention, I've touched on that too. But again, we made sure that we talked through, and especially with COVID-19, we did have to do some pivoting in looking at what might be available for home health, where there at least certain visits that allowed us to have some of these procedures done within the home. So, blood pressure checks, vitals, etc. The things to consider with UC and IBD is that, especially with the endoscopies, you cannot do that at home. So there were some aspects that just had to be considered, some pivots and maybe some deviations in timelines. But again, it was just something to consider. And I will say, moving forward, we're just always now being proactive to just have protocols and things in place, allowing us to pivot quickly if we should hopefully not find this again, but if we should find situations where we need to ensure that patients and sites are able to be more resilient during times of a type of pandemic. But overall, I think it was very helpful. I will emphasize communication was key in the study as a whole. We had, again, very comprehensive tactics, but the biggest part of it was just that communication with the sites. So I'll tie it back to, again, Georgia and the direct in-country patient recruitment support. They were able to help us be that line of sight with sites to communicate and escalate any issues, any even positive aspects. But we were able to have this really great communication network that helped us in the success overall, because sites felt like they were able to get what they needed quickly, again, versus having to wait and see what happens. We were very proactive in a sense. So just key takeaways of all of this. So engagement. There was an engagement of the investigators really in the beginning as well with regards to the IP and the mechanism of action. There was upfront interest. I mean, obviously they signed on, and that could be said and hold true for any study, but especially in this case, the physicians and anyone involved was really excited about the IAP and again, the MOA as a whole. So I think that excitement translated, and pun intended, when we're looking at this globally, but really translated across from the beginning. So that helped just kind of set this really strong foundation. But then what we did was we built off of that with consistent study and site communications, keeping them updated about the study. We were very cohesive in our site communications. So we made sure that we streamlined the communications as a whole with the sites and with just even patients as a whole, developing those tools. And then the team environment, again, we have, of course, the sponsor ourselves, we had the CRO and any of our vendors, which I will call partners. We all worked together and we kept those lines of communications open. We set the stage to say, if you see something, hear something, please escalate it up. So that way, again, we could all work together to handle the situation and deal with any form of problem quickly and efficiently. So I think that was really set in the beginning, and that just translated throughout the course of the study. So that was key. I will say to our study manager at the time on our side, I always give kudos, but he also carried that throughout. And it was just demonstrated throughout to be able to have this very great partnership across anyone involved in the study, including our site partners as well. And we got some great responses from sites. In the end of all of it, there was a survey, and that was really the outstanding thing, was sites felt like they were getting the information they needed, they were getting the support they needed, and they had that open communication and questions as well. They felt just that they had the support. So that kind of lends itself to the last part too, but just keeping everyone informed of the activities, and just everything was complementary to each other with our partnerships. So now I will hand it back to Georgia, and thank you all so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nicole. Okay, so I'm going to get on to some of the country insights now. So hopefully you would see the most recent poll pop up on your screen. So the question is, what do you think was the biggest recruitment barrier in Thailand? And there should be 3 options. So option 1 was COVID-19. Option 2 is patients not being in active flare, or option 3 was competing studies. So thank you to all of those that have answered. I'm just going to end the poll now. So you've all agreed that it would be COVID-19 would be the biggest recruitment barrier. So if you can see my screen, the actual biggest recruitment barrier that Thailand was facing was actually to do with competing studies. And when the recruitment specialists dug a little bit deeper, it was in particular competing studies that actually had an oral administration as opposed to an injection. So interestingly, in some countries, a subcutaneous injection is seen as a positive thing, but in Thailand, it seemed like patients were actually opting for studies that had an oral administration. So again, a different barrier to what we were expecting and very different across the study. Another aspect that was competing with the Tuscany 2 study was the patient access program. Now, this was a government-funded program, and many patients were opting in for this because it was a registered drug as opposed to a clinical trial. And then another key thing, which also impacted recruitment in Thailand, was that there was several sites in Thailand. Some were private sites and some were parts of the Ministry of Public Health. Interestingly, the sites that were part of the Ministry of Public Health were recruiting really well, and the private sites weren't recruiting as well. So when the recruitment specialist was discussing this with the sites, essentially patients that are treated by the Ministry of Public Health can only be referred to private sites if there are no other available medications or if the doctors can't diagnose them. So again, these useful insights are shared with the sponsor, so obviously with Pfizer at the time, and this can also kind of help with site feasibility and site site selection on future studies. But yes, the type of sites really impacted how well the particular sites were recruiting in Thailand. Another aspect was that the HIV is highly prevalent in Thailand. So that was related to the eligibility criteria. And another reported barrier in Thailand was the use of the e-diary. Again, these weren't common barriers reported across the study. These are very Thailand-specific barriers. So this is just some of the insights we wanted to share from Thailand. In terms of country-specific strategies, as I've mentioned, patients needed to be in active flare. So one of the potential strategies was ensuring that patients were screened quickly. So essentially reducing the time in which it takes for patients to be screened. So making sure that they're prioritized and making sure that the patients then were in active flare. As I mentioned, this was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So some sites actually administered the study drug prescription via the internet, which prevented patients actually having to go in and visit the site. So this also kind of alleviated the burden from the site, but also kind of any worry from the patient having to actually go in to get these prescriptions. And as I mentioned, one of the barriers was the e-diary. Patients sites needed to ensure that patients were fully trained on how to use the e-diary. And actually, one particular site conducted a virtual training session to support sites and patients as well. So I just wanted to kind of share some Thailand specific barriers and kind of highlight the importance of the recruitment support and how the individual approach was tailored depending on the individual site's need and the country. So we're going to move on now to France. So this is kind of barriers related in France. So France is quite an interesting one because typically in France, they can be quite reluctant to receive recruitment support, and the sites have strong recruitment strategies and recruit fairly well. So typically the uptake, this was an optional service, typically the uptake wouldn't be as high as what we anticipated, but actually 4 out of the 5 sites in France opted in to receive some form of recruitment support. And overall, the screening rate, because of a contributing factor because of this, actually resulted in the screening rate and the randomization rate being 3 times higher than the target in France. So you can see hopefully the sheer contrast in barriers compared to Thailand, which is what I just presented. So I'm going to move on to some country-specific barriers in France. Again, not to a huge surprise, but there was some concerns around the washout period being too long. And then there was some COVID-19 related pressures. So in general, some endoscopies were actually cancelled due to the COVID-19 pressures. And then one site just felt the eligibility criteria was just quite difficult to meet. So lots of them were kind of protocol related, but also, which isn't too surprising, some COVID-19 anticipated barriers and country specific barriers. If we move on kind of to the strategies, they actually rely heavily on kind of internal schedule review and pre-screening. But also in France, they have a strong external referral network, and kind of the in-country patient recruitment specialists supported France in kind of enhancing that particular strategy. So kind of how to build and continue to have strong external referral networks. So one particular site kind of took some of the feedback from the recruitment specialist, and they held a quarterly meeting with the external private physicians. And that was to ensure that the study was at the forefront of their mind and kind of addressed any issues or questions they might have. And again, this utilized some of the recruitment materials. So there was a study intro presentation, which was site facing, but also could share some of the patient recruitment materials as well. So this just kind of shows the differences. Hopefully you can see just in the 2 examples I've given there between Thailand and France, the differences and the barriers and the strategies which each country faced. So I'm now going to pass over to Barbara, who's going to provide some insights on Poland. So Barbara, over to you when you're ready.
Thank you, Georgia. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barbara Orlos-Kaminska. I'm a clinical enrollment manager working for Innovative Trials for 4 years. I'm based in Poland and I support Polish sites. I was involved as a clinical enrollment manager in Tuscany 2 trial, and I will share my experience with you. There were 9 active sites in Tuscany 2 trial, 8 supported by me. And as you can see, screening rate at sites supported by in-country specialist was 0.92, whereas screening rate at sites not supported, 0.39. Randomization rate, 0.43. For sites supported by me and 0 for non-in-country specialist supported sites. And I think that numbers already show how the great impact can the in-country specialist have on the enrollment. Country-specific recruitment strategies in Poland, database review, external referrals, patient-to-patient referrals, and online advertising. Database review is the main recruitment strategy in Poland. Usually, patients stay with their physician. So usually, patient stays where he is diagnosed. External referrals, I'm thinking here about referrals from physicians' colleagues. So there is still a kind of relationship between the referring side and investigational side. Referrals from completely external source are rare in Poland. Patient-to-patient referrals, this was reported by one of sites. They told me that patients are exchanging their experiences. For example, when they are waiting in waiting area at the site or at family events, or they are looking for more information through social media. So they are exchanging their experiences and looking for new treatment opportunities, looking for good physicians. And what I think was the great success in Tuscany 2 trial was that we had private sites involved in the study, and private sites usually do not have resources issues. There is easier access to the healthcare provider, especially in pandemic time. Percentage difference for screening rate was 136% for sites supported by in-country specialists in comparison to non-supported sites. Randomization rate was 0.43 higher. Okay, I was talking about strategies and now about barriers which were identified in Poland. There was a high screening failure rate due to endoscopy results and the laboratory results. And my suggestion how we could avoid it is to carefully review available medical records just to be sure that we do not include patients who are already pre-screening failures, who could be eliminated at earlier stage. Lack of UC diagnosis. This was reported by the site who okay. I'm sorry, I need to back to the previous slide because I forgot about one crucial strategy. This is online advertising. One site used online advertising as a strategy, and they just shared general study information on their Facebook just as indication, and they had quite good feedback, many patients from this source. But this is also connected to the barrier, because they noticed that they had many patients who did not confirmation of ulcerative colitis diagnosis. So the suggestion here was to create a pre-screening checklist and to interview patient carefully before scheduling the on-site visit. Another barrier was the low disease activity, and suggestion here was to build a watch list for patients who can meet eligibility at a later stage, and just to be in touch with their patient to check periodically their status. COVID-19, this was pandemic time, so suggestion here was to offer flexible office hours and to follow safety measures. And what is interesting here, whereas COVID-19 was a recruitment barrier for most sites, one side reported that this was indeed a kind of advantage for them, because the access to the medical professionals was limited, especially at public hospitals, and patients had to look for new opportunities at another sites. And one site reported that they indeed have more patients in pandemic time. Competitive trials, it's hard to overcome this barrier, but as a part of the service, there were monthly calls with the sites, and I think that calls allowed the site to keep them motivated and to allowed them to think about Tuscany 2 trial, just not to forget the trial. The phone call sometimes was not a big thing, just a short talk and a reminder, but I think it counts. Okay, and I just wanted to let you know that I see a new trend in Poland now. It's not about Tuscany 2 trial, but generally I see that social media advertising is becoming more and more popular in Poland. Sites are willing to use social media to post about clinical trials on their Facebook or on patient advocacy groups. Some sites even have their own template, which they submit to ethics committee and use on their social media, but still for most sites they rely on study specific materials. And this is all for me. Thank you. And Georgia, I leave the floor for you.
Perfect, thank you. Brilliant. So this is just really a summary, just to kind of summarize kind of the insights that have been shared by Nicole and Barbara, and some of the insights I shared regarding Thailand and France. So what I'm hoping kind of after this presentation, what you've seen is that it's not a one size fits all approach. Each country had its own unique barriers, and each recruitment strategy was tailored specifically on a country level at a minimum, but also in some instances at a site level. So hopefully it really highlights the importance of taking a local approach to global studies, and the importance of having recruitment specialists locally. Obviously, Barbara's given some great examples where she knows the local culture and the local requirements. So that allows her to tailor and provide a bespoke service to the sites that are relevant to the country and to the individual sites. So I'm hoping kind of the examples that we've shared throughout really demonstrate the importance of local approach. And I know I have ended on a poll, and it seems like lots of you have already answered, which is great. So the poll is, do you think that in-country patient recruitment support would benefit your studies? And I would say a whopping 75% of you have said yes. So, I mean, that's excellent. And I'm really hoping that this particular case study, especially for this study, really demonstrates and highlights the importance and the benefit it can bring to your global studies. I know, Barbara, you shared some great statistics for Poland, for example, and the sheer contrast in the screening rate and the enrollment rate compared to sites that did have the remote support and sites that didn't. So thank you all, and thank you for answering the poll.
Thank you very much indeed for those incredibly insightful presentations, panelists. And now we move on to the Q&A session, and thanks very much to the audience members who've come up with some very interesting and probing questions for our panel. So I shall start at the beginning, as they say. Can you share more information on the branding or materials developed for your studies? Who's going to take that first?
I'm happy to take this one. Yeah, so in terms of the branding, the colours were kind of determined or decided between us and Pfizer. So there was a colour palette that had to be worked to. In the end, they were maroon and blue, maroon and green. And then in terms of the type of materials, there was loads. There was some site-facing materials, some patient-facing, and some physician-facing materials as well. And kind of, as Nicole said, the majority of these they're available to all sites. Whether or not the individual sites use them, obviously because of the sheer contents, they wouldn't necessarily all be appropriate, but kind of in terms of the site-facing materials, there was a study intro presentation, which I know lots of them used internally at Lunch and Learns and with external referring providers. There was also kind of quick fact cards about the study, which they could hold when introducing the study to the patients. There was some doctor-to-doctor referral letter guidance as well, materials developed. And then in terms of site facing, there was patient brochures, flyers, posters. And then in terms of some unique tactics, I know there was a radio advert, Facebook adverts, and patient advocacy group text as well. So really there was a huge amount of materials, which hopefully, I appreciate maybe not all the sites would use them all, but given the sheer size of the study, given the number of materials, it really allowed the sites to individually select the materials that were most beneficial to them, to their country, and to their particular tactics. And the recruitment materials were available in multiple languages for those countries as well. And I know during the kind of remote support that was provided to these sites, in some instances, if there was a particular language that wasn't available, we would kind of flag that to the Pfizer study team, and potentially there would be additional languages added if the individual sites needed those as well, obviously depending on IRB approval.
And this is Nicole, if I can just add on, not to labor the branding, but I think this was key. So we mentioned the very comprehensive kit. So in addition to that, Innovative also created basically a guidebook to explain what each piece is, the intended use, and just some additional ideas for sites on how to use and maybe maximize utilizing the tools. So I think that was very helpful from both the site perspective, but also utilized by the CRAs to just kind of help emphasize and re-emphasize the usage. And then also for the branding, because this had such a global nature, we wanted to keep the imagery kind of neutral and being able to be identifiable really across such a wide range of global. So we used more of like a, cartoon imagery versus real people in this sense. It was just to allow us to be, again, more, I guess, appropriate across so many different global footprints. So we just took that into consideration as well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Nicole, about tailoring branding towards specific communities. And that in many ways is what this is all about. Right, next question is regarding how COVID-19 impacted on patient recruitment. And I suppose because, although the wider world thinks the COVID threat is petering out a bit, but of course with vulnerable patients, it's still something they are still navigating. So tell us a bit more about how that impacts on patient recruitment.
So I can start with that one. we of course there was a point where we had to pause all screening and enrollment. So that was a huge impact right there with regards to timelines. But even as we're able to open up the doors, so to speak, there's still concerns, especially in this case where often the treatments are immunosuppressants. So we're already looking at suppressing your immune system to something where you need your immune system. So there were those concerns. So again, this will tie back, and you'll hear me say it often, is the site communication. So we worked very hard, across the team to, of course, inform sites and really give them some ideas, tips, tricks. I mean, it sounds silly, but truthfully, that's what it was. Just working together to have some talking points, to talk to sites and really guide them, give them some tools on how they could communicate things to their patients. We certainly never want to come across that physicians especially don't know how to speak to their patients and communicate. So it was really just working across even sites. And I know this ties back to having those local recruitment specialists. They can just help to convey some of these tools, maybe hear from a site, this is how I'm approaching the topic, and this has been successful for me, and just conveying to my patients of how we're making sure we are keeping their safety. I mean, their safety is top of mind. This is how I'm communicating that. And then they could share those best practices across other sites as well. And again, it's just sharing ideas. Sites can really use that however they see fit. Maybe they say, yeah, I like that wording, but I'm going to use this term instead. I find this has a better kind of impact to my patients. So it's just really using that toolbox and that communication to help share those best practices so sites have that, again, in their overarching toolkit.
Yeah. I completely agree. I know some of the suggestions provided by the CEMs and by the sites were kind of staggering appointments to making sure that there wasn't too many patients at the site at one time. I know they also staggered the type of patient visiting the site. So if they had a set illness, maybe they'd be in the afternoon, and more patients that appeared healthier, maybe not with a cough or a cold, would come in the morning. Also, just providing reassurance to the patients of the mitigation plans that they've put in place. So kind of mask wearing and kind of cleaning in between patients. I know one site was concerned about recruitment materials being left out. So they actually laminated one of the posters, and they put kind of recruitment materials in packs as well. So definitely providing the kind of recruitment specialist provided suggestions, and obviously share best practices, like you said, Nicole, across the site. So in some instances, the sites were teaching us things, and we could relay that to other sites. And that's the beauty of this service, is kind of the communication pathway continues. And there was always set questions about COVID. At every call, because obviously it couldn't be ignored. And if for whatever reason we believed that COVID was potentially impacting recruitment, so say if they were prioritizing COVID-19 patients, we would make sure that action was flagged as quickly as possible to Pfizer, to potentially consider putting that site on a recruitment hold as well. So again, absolutely clear communication and providing suggestions across the study.
Marvelous. And it's reassuring to hear in the digital era, Georgia, that people are still laminating stuff. Now, here's a question which would be good for Barbara. It's about how the culture of in-country recruitment support is being, I suppose, rolled out, and why some sites decide to opt for it in Poland and why some sites wouldn't.
Enrollment specialist, it's still a little bit, how to say it, unknown thing in Poland. It's more and more popular. As far as I remember, 40% of people at the beginning answered that they know this kind of service. So I think that we can say that some sites are thinking that I'm trying to sell something to them. So they just don't, sometimes investigators don't give us time to explain what our service include. They are just saying tough no, and there is no further discussion. And I think this is the reason why some sites are not interested in the service.
Yes. So I suppose it's like anything, you need to kind of get the word out there and have lots of examples where it has been a really dynamic thing to do, for people to have that essential trust. But I mean, the fact that it's working in some sites, hopefully that will develop in the future. Right, in terms of what it takes to identify patients early, and what should a team start doing to prepare for those first patients, and indeed what is the process for identifying suitable patients?
So I'm happy to take that one as well. And just I can share across experiences, especially within, the IBD space. So, again, it goes back to engaging sites as early as possible. I will say there's kind of a sweet spot in timing, because the sites are getting selected for the study itself and startup process. There's operational logistical aspects that sites are focused on just to be able to screen a subject and contracting, et cetera. But more and more, we're striving to, even as part of site selection and selecting the right sites for this type of study, trying to at least get some of those top line questions in with regards to recruitment, understanding their current, again, patient networking, both internal opportunities and external opportunities. And that can help us to just at least start to plant the seed for sites, to have them have that understanding that, okay, as part of your selection and as part of your becoming a member of this study and a partner with us, we are going to set the expectation of, we're going to work with you to develop a recruitment plan, making sure that they understand the purpose of this plan is not to tick a box and say that it's done. There really is a purpose behind all of this planning and outlining timelines, is we want to ensure that we, as a partner as well, understand what you have currently and what you need up front. And then part of that will come into then the early planning of the patients. So helping the site to ensure that upfront they're understanding the IE criteria. It's made mention that there's competing studies. So a lot of these studies can have very similar criteria as far as what's inclusive and exclusive. But we want to make sure that they have a full understanding of what our protocol is asking. And then we can work with them to, again, provide them with the tools. So we do have a pre-screening tool that we can offer to them. It just helps them to comb through and really tease out those patients. I think it was mentioned too, that will not fit the criteria no matter what's going to happen. So it can help them bump out and really start to drill down what patients they have. Part of that is, again, I'll go back to just the selection. We want to have them really truly understand what their patient population is. We know often what sites will do. And let me just say, I come from the site level. I used to be a study coordinator myself. So, often it will be, let me kind of guesstimate, kind of based on what I've done before on some of these studies. But then as you get into the actual criteria, you might find there's a particular criteria that'll bump some out that you didn't anticipate. So we're asking them to do this exercise earlier in the game, so that way they can truly understand and say, yeah, I feel confident that I can get you X number of subjects from this study. Here's how I'm going to do it. And then we just start to put those wheels in motion early on. The timing of it all, I see that question, and hopefully I can answer it here. I would say at the very least, you start to work, and this is where we work with sites backwards, is we anticipate we're going to get an SIV for you at this date. Let's start to work backwards there on, maybe it's 2 months, 8 weeks beforehand, to start to look at your patient base and just really have a full understanding. I would say maybe that would be average, but I will also say, again, to my earlier point, some sites may think that's still too early because I'm still going to be in the thick of trying to do everything else to get started. But that, I would say, would be a good time frame to at least start to work with sites and to plant that seed to have those discussions. So when they are SIV'd and activated, they've already done that work to have at least a bolus of patients that they plan to bring in.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And that's really important, I think, as people form a template for how they're going to do this in their minds. The next question doesn't pull any punches at all. It's about the sort of long-term in-country support. Does it involve call center agents?
No, so they're not call center agents. As I mentioned, so the in-country support, they have clinical research experience. So they might have been study coordinators themselves. They might have been CRAs, or study managers. So they've got research experience, but they also have a special kind of passion about the recruitment side of things, or might have been involved in kind of recruitment at a study level as well. So they've got the experience, and kind of typically the support could be provided either remotely. So it could be remote support, which would be via a video call, but it's definitely not a call center. As I've kind of mentioned, yes, there will be set topics. It's about recruitment, so there will be a discussion around their strategies, their barriers, looking at their recruitment plan and recruitment targets. But it's definitely not kind of a question and answer call center appearance. It's providing a bespoke service for the individual site's needs, putting in place goals with the sites based on what the capability of the sites, and also kind of their strategies and their recruitment targets, and then following up with the sites. So there's lots of layers to it. They have to build strong relationships with the sites, make them aware of their expertise, but also support them, and kind of share insights that the site might have, and potentially sometimes the site has information they want to share with the sponsor, so making sure that we're escalating appropriately. So it's definitely not a call center approach. On this particular study, it was only remote support, but it was bespoke remote support depending on the individual site's needs. In some instances, the support can actually go on site, so there was actually potential to have on-site support and chart review, but for this particular service, because the COVID-19 pandemic, it was all done remotely. So yeah, in some instances, they can be very hands-on and actually go and visit the site and actually do some chart review as well. So it really depends on the type of service, but it's certainly not a call center.
Yeah. Hey, just to summarize, not a call center. Thanks very much, Georgia. Now, and I think this is an important question, sort of in the era of TikTok and not having a lot of time and short attention spans and that kind of thing. How important is the impact of animation, video resources, and that kind of thing, as opposed to the old system of reams of paper with tiny type on it? Nicole?
Yeah, so let me just make sure I understand the question. So is this asking about just using social media and just doing more of the video components?
Yeah,
traditional.
I think it's anything really that engages people, that doesn't require them to have to read the Old Testament.
Yeah. So this is an interesting topic. I actually noted it too. Particularly for, again, IBD space with regards to social media. So you heard Barbara share about a site in Poland who utilized Facebook. And I didn't mention in the tactics, we did use online outreach. So we had a study website, pre-screener, and we did do some online outreach and digital campaigns within the US. We focused that centralized approach there. We did provide, of course, and this also ties back to the individual site support. Sites were saying, again, Poland is one example, but we did have some sites say, I'd like to do it on my own accord. So they wanted their own budget to be able to run local advertising. All that said, what we found both centrally and as you've heard even from a local perspective, it's not a huge impact. You certainly will get UC patients who will respond to the ads and be referred to sites. That's not the issue. The issue comes more to the bottom end of the funnel, is what we call, which is you'll have a lot of patients who aren't in active disease or who aren't even diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. They may have some other IBD issue. And so that end result is very low. In our case, we only had one randomization come from the campaign in the end, a good amount of referrals. We were almost in the 200s, but in the end only had one randomization come from all of that. So it's an opportunity to, of course, reach more patients, and I would say build those watch lists that's been referenced. So helping sites to comb through and build up and communicate, contact those patients who may not be the right fit yet, but could be later on. So that end of the spectrum. So I think there's opportunities there as far as, you know, creating a video. We didn't create one that was patient facing, I'll say, for this one. We did more of the physician facing side of it to, again, build on that momentum and that interest in the indication and the drug itself. But for patient facing, I mean, certainly that is an opportunity, I would say, to do so. I know we've been doing that with regards to consenting. Some of these consents can be very daunting and overwhelming, especially if you get in an adolescent space. But I think there's opportunities there to create more of that video to help introduce patients, and you could post that on YouTube and things like that. I will say the one thing that can get, from, I'd say, an expense perspective, is when you're doing that globally, you have to consider all the translations and language. It's possible, but you just ultimately have to look at the impact. So what we'll often find is that'll be selective in some countries, both cost, but I'll say also culturally. There's some countries that do not allow that type of approach with regards to using video, using social media as a way to present clinical trials.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And that was perfectly on the hour. So thank you very much to Nicole. Thank you to Georgia. Thank you to Barbara. This webinar will be available on the website. So when you've finished watching Happy Valley, you can whack this on and enjoy this fascinating discussion all over again. Thanks very much to our audience, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.